The Levite's concubine. This story is as disturbing as they come. It's found in Judges 19 to 21 and is often called the Benjamite War. It starts with a Levite from Ephraim and his concubine traveling through the town of Gibeah in Benjamin. What happens next is horrifying. A mob surrounds them, wanting to assault the Levite, and in a shocking twist, he hands over his concubine to the crowd. They abuse her until she collapses, and eventually she dies from the brutal treatment. The Levite, instead of mourning privately, dismembers her body and sends the pieces to the other tribes of Israel. The outrage from this act is explosive. The tribes vow not to give their daughters to the Benjamites in marriage, which sparks a war that nearly wipes out the tribe, leaving just 600 men alive. But soon remorse sets in as the Israelites realize that an entire tribe might disappear because of their vengeance. To keep their oath while still saving the Benjamites, they attack Jabesh Gilead, a city that wasn't involved, and take 400 virgins to become wives for the Benjamites. For the 200 men still without wives, they're allowed to abduct women dancing at Shiloh. It's a grim, shocking episode of cruelty, but it shows how chaos and violence can spiral when human hearts turn to vengeance. King Saul. On the surface, Saul seemed like the perfect king. He was tall, good-looking, and from a wealthy family, and people admired him. But the cracks were there from the start. When Samuel, the prophet, presented him as king, Saul acted cowardly. He struggled to obey God's commands fully, showing that underneath the royal image, he was insecure and unfaithful. Saul's villainy didn't explode immediately. It grew as his jealousy of David festered. Hearing praise for David, Saul tried to kill him multiple times, even chasing him through the wilderness, plotting murder while David refused to retaliate. Yet David still mourned Saul's death in battle, showing the difference between someone ruled by envy and someone ruled by faith. But Saul's missteps went beyond jealousy. He ignored God's command to annihilate the Amalekites, a decision that eventually allowed a descendant, Haman, to threaten the Jewish people. Saul even resorted to necromancy out of fear, consulting the witch of Endor to summon Samuel's spirit. A total contradiction, since he had previously sought to ban witches. Saul misunderstood that God cared more about a faithful heart than ritual obedience. While David's faith was wholehearted, Saul's was not, which led to disastrous consequences. Cain. Cain, Adam and Eve's firstborn, is infamous for being the first murderer. He let jealousy consume him when God favored Abel's offering, and instead of listening to God's warning, he killed his brother. The shock isn't just in the act itself, but in God's response. He rebuked Cain, yet also extended mercy, marking him so that no one would harm him in revenge. Even with mercy, Cain's heart never seemed to turn. He never repented, and his descendants inherited a streak of wickedness, contrasting sharply with the line of Seth, who followed God. The legacy of Cain's hatred carried forward, shaping the biblical understanding of sin and murder. New Testament writers connect those who hate their brothers and sisters with Cain's murderous spirit, showing how jealousy and hatred can consume hearts. The story serves as a warning. When jealousy and hatred creep in, we are reminded of God's mercy through Christ, who died for us even when we were undeserving. Cain's failure encourages believers to forgive and choose love over bitterness, showing that grace can always break cycles of sin. Balaam. Another notorious figure is Balaam, mentioned in the same New Testament passage that warns about Cain. Balaam was a diviner hired by the king of Moab to curse Israel. He is famous for talking to his donkey, but his story is more sinister. His powers were demonic in origin, yet God used him to bless Israel instead of cursing them. 3 times Balaam pronounced blessings over Israel's enemies. But Balaam's intentions were never pure. He encouraged the Moabites to tempt Israel into sexual immorality and idolatry, which led to a deadly plague, killing 24,000 people. Only the zeal of Phinehas stopped the destruction. Balaam's story became a warning about the dangers of deception and false teaching. Even when someone speaks seemingly right words, their heart and choices can cause immense harm. This lesson still applies today. Christians are urged to be careful of false teachers who sound like they follow God, but seek harm. Like Balaam, these people exist to mislead. Jude encourages believers to contend for the faith, showing that vigilance and discernment are key in resisting evil influences. Jeroboam. Jeroboam's story shows how ambition and disobedience can corrupt even those chosen by God. The 10 tribes of Israel were given to him after Solomon's failures. God promised him a lasting dynasty if he obeyed the law. But Jeroboam ignored this, following in the footsteps of previous idolaters. He made 2 golden calves for worship, diverting people from the temple in Jerusalem and setting up centers in Dan and Bethel. He mixed idolatry with worship of the Lord, creating a toxic spiritual environment that angered God. His actions became a pattern for later kings who did wrong, and the idolatry he promoted led to the exile of northern Israel. Only under King Josiah were these altars finally destroyed. Jeroboam shows how disobedience can create cycles of spiritual failure and suffering, but also that reform is possible with faithful leadership. Satan. Of course, when talking about evil in the Bible, nothing compares to Satan. While people like Cain, Balaam, Jezebel, and Judas committed terrible deeds, Satan is the ultimate adversary. Unlike humans, he is a fallen angel who rebelled against God before humanity sinned. God created everything very good, but Satan turned against him, bringing corruption and death. His first move in human history was in the Garden of Eden, deceiving Adam and Eve into disobedience. From then on, he worked to derail God's plans, fueling hatred, pride, and greed in people like Haman and Saul, and even trying to destroy Christ through Herod, tempting Jesus in the wilderness, and influencing Judas to betray him. Even though Satan thought he had won with Jesus' death, the resurrection changed everything. Jesus' sacrifice defeated sin and death, showing that evil will ultimately fail. Satan will continue to oppose God and deceive the world, but his defeat is certain. Revelation 20:10 seals his fate in the lake of fire, and God's kingdom is unshakable. Until then, believers are called to stay alert, putting on God's armor, because the real struggle is spiritual, not human. Even though Satan is dangerous, God's power ensures that good prevails. Judah and Tamar. The Bible has some shocking stories, and this one definitely fits. Tamar's story starts with tragedy. Her husband dies, and then she's supposed to marry his next brother, but he dies too. By tradition, she's meant to marry the third brother, yet Judah, her father-in-law, refuses. He thinks she's cursed and doesn't want to risk losing another son. So Tamar takes matters into her own hands. Disguising herself as a prostitute, she tricks Judah into sleeping with her, and she gets pregnant. When Judah finds out, he's furious and wants her burned alive. But Tamar reveals that he is the father, and in a shocking twist, Judah calls her more righteous than he is. It's a messy story full of deception, hypocrisy, and even incest, and the Bible calls it exactly what it is: a perversion. Leviticus 20:12 even says that such acts should be punished by death, showing how seriously God regarded this. Even though it's disturbing, the story also highlights human cleverness and courage. Tamar's actions ensured her place in the lineage of Judah, which would eventually lead to King David and ultimately Jesus. Even in the middle of chaos and wrongdoing, God's plan still moved forward. Judas Iscariot. When it comes to betrayal, Judas Iscariot takes the infamous spot. He was one of Jesus' own disciples, but sold him to the chief priests for 30 pieces of silver. On the night of Jesus' arrest, Judas led soldiers into the Garden of Gethsemane and identified Jesus with a kiss, a symbol of friendship twisted into ultimate treachery. Judas's guilt was immediate. He tried to return the money, confessing that he had betrayed innocent blood, but the priest refused. Despair consumed him, and he hanged himself. His betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a strike against God himself, making his name a symbol of ultimate evil. Although the story is dark, it reminds us that guilt and remorse can follow wrongdoing. Even in the worst situations, acknowledging sin is the first step toward redemption, and God's plan continues despite human failures. Pharaoh of the Exodus. The Pharaoh during the Exodus represents cruelty on a massive scale. He enslaved the Israelites, forcing them into exhausting labor, and refused to obey God's command to let them go. Instead, he hardened his heart against each plague God sent. Rivers turning to blood, locusts, swarms of insects, darkness covering the land, and eventually the death of every firstborn. Even after all this devastation, Pharaoh's change of heart was temporary. Once the Israelites escaped, he gathered his army to bring them back into slavery. But God intervened, parting the Red Sea for Israel and then drowning Pharaoh's army. This is a clear example of pride turning into pure evil. The story also shows that defiance and cruelty have consequences. God's justice is real, but so is his deliverance. Even when facing a powerful oppressor, God's people can be saved through faith and obedience. Jezebel is remembered as one of the Bible's most wicked women. A Phoenician princess married to King Ahab of Israel, she promoted the worship of Baal, a pagan god whose cult involved ritual prostitution and even child sacrifice. Under her influence, God's prophets were hunted and killed, while hundreds of pagan priests replaced them. Her evil didn't stop there. When King Ahab wanted Naboth's vineyard, Jezebel arranged for false accusations and murder so the king could take the land. Her abuse of power and deceit made her infamous. A prophecy foretold her disgrace, saying she would die and be devoured by dogs, which eventually came true. Her name has since become a symbol of corruption and cruelty. Even though Jezebel's story is terrifying, it warns against the dangers of abusing power and ignoring God. At the same time, it shows that God's justice is sure, even if it takes time. These are some of the most evil people in the Bible. What do you think about them? Let us know in the comments if you think any of them weren't truly evil or just needed redemption.